is from the Agency for Instructional Technology, AIT.
Making sure the size of things within your drawing is correct requires careful observation. The relative scale of an object must compare to another. So Paul will introduce you to ways of drawing proportions as you see them.
This is a drawing of a cylinder, side view. So the circle becomes an oval. And anything you draw is in a certain proportion. Now this cylinder is in a proportion of a number of different objects. It is not in a proportion of a coin. It's too thick for that. But it is in the proportion of an automobile tire or a truck tire. Now, they vary in size, but they're by and large, in the same proportion. You would have a hubcap here, and you would have tread. And now you not only see the proportion, but you have enough details to see what this object is. Now if I draw something with this, suppose I draw a man standing beside it. I have the proportion of the man that I'm concerned with. That the man would be in proportion. But I have another concern. And that is, not only is the man in the proportion of an adult figure, but he's in proportion to this tire. In this case, it would look like a truck tire because it's larger than an automobile tire compared to the figure of a man. So here I've introduced you to two concerns of proportion. First, the proportion of the object. Here, the man beside the truck tire. Also, the proportion of the man here. Then the second concern is the proportion of relationship. That is the relationship between this object and this object. So if you're drawing one object, you have the one concern. But if you have one object grouped with another object, then you have the concern of one relationship of an object to the relationship of another object grouped with it. In this program, we're concerned with proportion. And I've explained here and demonstrated the two proportions we're concerned with. The proportion of an individual object, the relation of the parts within that object. Then if we have a grouping, the relationship of that object to the other objects in the grouping. Here's a nice drawing, but it's an example of poor proportion. What's out of proportion here in these objects? First, the milk container. I've never seen a milk container in that proportion. I've seen them square and tall and rectangular. But this object is out of proportion within itself, its sides to its height. The next is an apple. The apple is in good proportion within itself, but it's out of proportion in relation to this object here. And in the glass here, it's in good proportion to itself, but it's out of proportion to the straw. The straw is way too wide in diameter for the size of the glass. And if you consider them all there, the spoon is too small. Although it's drawn correctly within proportion, it's too small for the other objects. Now let me make a demonstration, a drawing, correcting some of these proportions and giving you some other tips in setting up the proportions and grouping objects to keep them in good proportion within themselves and good proportion in relationship to the other objects that's grouped around them. Now, if you remember the units in the other picture that was out of proportion, we had an apple, a milk container, a spoon, and a glass and a straw. We want to draw them within proportion to each other and also in correct proportion to each object. The first thing I think about in placing these, and you'll have trouble when you first start drawing in still life, is think of the surface in which you'll place them on. The eye view and the eye level of the surface. So if we have a table here, we're going to place our objects on a table, I want to know the perspective of that table so I can place each object on that. I like to start with a base. Say this is the milk container. This is going to be a square milk container. So drawn in perspective, the base would look about like this in relation to this base. Then you may draw up. This is not only true in objects like this, but it's also true in drawing especially shoes or soles or feet that are on the ground. Now the milk container, a small one, is usually in this proportion. It's square, block, and then we have a pointed top to it, like this. And it opens up here. But seen in perspective, it will look something like that. And this would probably be what? Half pint? Now this is much better perspective than the drawing we showed you before, which was out of perspective. Not only that, it's setting on the flat surface. Now let's add the next object, a glass. Now the glass is circular in shape, the base is circular in shape. But how much oval are you going to see? You must judge with your eye that you're going to see about the same amount of oval from an eye view as you saw the square here. So you're seeing a good part of the square, you're going to see a good part of the oval here. It won't be just a slit, it will be in perspective to this, and it will be in proportion. So the base of the glass would look to me something like that in relation to this and in eye level. Then it's a matter of drawing up. And I can make the glass taller because glasses come in so many different proportions as far as the diameter to the sides. Up here, I'll have another oval. And you'll notice the top oval, the opening of a glass, will be a flatter oval than down here. And the reason is, it's further away from the eye level. We know the eye level must be up here somewhere because we're looking down on the objects. So the closer we get to the eye level, the narrower that oval will become until when it hits the eye level, it'll just be simply a straight line. And the further down we get, the larger the oval appears. So what have we done here? We have drawn an object that is in proportion to itself, its diameter to its sides. We've also drawn another one, it's in proportion to itself, its sides to its width. And we've drawn an object that is in relation to another object in proportion, and we've placed them both on the same surface. Now that's the beginning of drawing, and that's what will give you the most problems, getting the proportions and getting them laying on the surface. Now if you come to the apple, we don't have a problem of placing it on the surface because it only touches at one place. It's a sphere or a ball, so you won't have too much of a problem. You will have a problem of proportion. And if I draw the apple this way, It simply means it's that size of an apple in relation to this object or this object. And we had a straw, and it was too wide in the other drawing. We knew that. Here, a straw in proportion to the glass would look more like this. And as it comes down into a fluid, then of course it loses its strong definition, and it may even wave. Now we had something else, a spoon. A spoon drawn in proportion to the objects here would be something like this. And here again we have different size of spoons. Would be a teaspoon or a soup spoon. And we don't have as much problem with placing on a flat surface the parts of the spoon because it only touches in two places, here and here. Now you'll see a shadow probably down here, and then you add your shading here. But what I'm demonstrating here are the problems that we have, not necessarily call them problems, I'd rather call them concerns, that keeps our proportions correct within an object and in relation to other objects. Now the next thing I could do is simply add shadow or shade, and I must determine a light source. I've probably already determined it when I suggested the shadow here. But the main thing is to get your proportions right first. Make sure your objects are resting on the flat surface, if it's the same surface. Then you can come in and add tone, detail, and any other small items. If this is a tablecloth, then of course you would have texture or pattern shown this way. And if it's stripes, that must follow the perspective. And we have the form shadow here, and then we would be thinking next about a cast shadow. So we've taken the first drawing, we looked at it, was out of proportion in several ways, and we've redrawn it in proportion and added the tips about keeping different objects on a flat surface setting on that surface.
Create a still life with at least 3 objects. Group them as you wish, and then make a sketch of them. First, make sure each object is in proportion to itself, and then that all objects are in proper scale to each other. As a drawing grows, the main subject is sketched in and checked for size, making sure its own internal proportions are correct. As you add other objects, then you must constantly inspect their size in relationship to the first subject and for their own internal proportions. Paul Ringler is produced by the Agency for Instructional Technology in association with the Oklahoma Educational Television Authority.